The silverware clattered against the fine china, the only sound more grating than my father's constant rhythmic belittling. We were seated in the private dining room of the city's most exclusive steakhouse, celebrating my older brother, Thomas's promotion to junior partner at Sterling and Associates. My family, the high society, Sterling, sat draped in Italian silk and arrogance, while I sat at the end of the table in a wrinkled navy blazer I'd worn for 16 hours straight. To them, I was the ghost, the middle child who had squandered a legacy to work a meaningless desk job at a firm they had never heard of. "Pass the salt, Leo," my father said, not even looking at me. As I handed it over, he paused, staring at my frayed cuff. He let out a long, theatrical sigh that silenced the table. "You know, it's a tragedy. Your brother is closing million-dollar deals. Your sister just launched her third gallery, and you look like you've been sleeping in a cubicle. Do you even have a savings account? Or are you still living off the pittance that little startup pays you?" My mother reached out, but not to comfort me. She adjusted my collar with a look of pure pity. "Darling, if you're struggling with rent, just ask. It's embarrassing for us when people ask what our second son does and we have to tell them you're a data coordinator. It sounds so industrial." Thomas chuckled, swirling a glass of vintage Bordeaux. "Leave him alone, Mom. Leo likes being the janitor of information. Someone has to do the grunt work while the rest of us run the world. Right, Leo? Here, go buy yourself a tie that doesn't scream entry level." He flicked a $20 bill across the table. It landed in my appetizers like a piece of trash. The social mask they wore was so thick they couldn't see the glow of the fire they were lighting. I didn't get angry. I didn't defend myself. I simply picked up the $20 bill, folded it neatly, and tucked it into my pocket. "Thanks, Thomas," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the medical shock they expected. "I'll make sure this goes exactly where it belongs." My father checked his Patek Philippe. "Enough, we need to finish up. The Sterling and Associates board is meeting in 20 minutes to finalize the merger with Aether Global. It's the biggest day in this family's history. Thomas, I want you in that room. Leo, you can take the leftovers home. I assume your meaningless desk job doesn't require you to be anywhere important tonight." The surgical strike was already in motion. They thought they were leaving me behind at the table, but they didn't realize I had been the one who set the table in the first place. As they stood up, adjusted their coats, and walked out toward the valet, I stayed seated for exactly 60 seconds. I pulled out my phone and sent a single encrypted text. "The target is moving. Open the doors." I walked out of the restaurant, but I didn't head for the subway. I stepped into a black sedan that had been idling at the curb. The driver didn't ask for an address. He simply nodded. As we pulled up to the Sterling and Associates skyscraper, I saw my father's limousine pulling into the VIP bay. They were laughing as they walked toward the private elevator, completely unaware that the permanent foreclosure of their world was waiting on the 50th floor. I entered through the service entrance, shedding my navy blazer to reveal the tailored, charcoal gray three-piece suit I had hidden underneath. I didn't need a badge to get past security. The guards stepped aside and bowed their heads. The janitor was gone. The ghost had materialized. By the time I reached the boardroom, my family was already inside, boasting to the other partners about the Sterling legacy. Stood outside the heavy mahogany doors, listening to my father's voice booming about how he was, about to swallow Aether Global whole. He didn't know that Aether wasn't a company you swallowed. It was a shadow that consumed everything it touched. I gripped the handle. The status flip was 1 second away. I pushed the doors open, and the sound of my father's laughter died so fast it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Every board member stood up in unison, their chairs scraping the floor in a frantic rush to show respect. My father stayed frozen in his seat, his mouth half open, staring at the son he had just insulted over a steak dinner. "You're late, Leo," the chairman said, stepping aside to offer me the head of the table. "I got held up," I said, looking directly at my father. "I was busy collecting a $20 investment." The mirror paradox of my life began 7 years ago. The night my father told me I didn't have the killer instinct required to carry the Sterling name. While my brother Thomas was being groomed with expensive internships, and my sister was given a blank check to pursue her artistic visions, I was handed a desk in the back of the family's accounting firm and told to stay out of the way. They wanted a shadow, someone to quietly manage the ledgers, while they basked in the glow of the spotlight. What they didn't realize was that when you force someone into the shadows, you give them the perfect vantage point to see every crack in the foundation. I spent those first 2 years acting as the janitor of the family's darkest secrets. While filing their meaningless paperwork, I discovered that the Sterling and Associates empire wasn't the invincible fortress my father claimed it to be. It was a hollow shell, built on a mountain of predatory loans and a series of medical shock accounting tricks designed to hide a massive internal deficit. My father wasn't a genius. He was a gambler who was running out of chips. He treated me like a low-level clerk because he was afraid that if I looked too closely at the numbers, I would see the permanent foreclosure looming on the horizon. Instead of warning him, I did what any disgrace would do. I started my own game, using a small inheritance from my grandmother, the only Sterling who ever looked me in the eye. I founded Aether Global. I didn't start it in a glass skyscraper with a press release. I started it in a windowless room with 3 of the most brilliant, overlooked analysts I'd met in the city's basement offices. We were the ghosts of the financial world, a team of outcasts who had been ridiculed by men like my father. We didn't build our wealth through flashy PR. We built it through a surgical strike strategy of acquiring undervalued assets that my family's firm had discarded as trash. For 5 years, I lived a double life that would have made a spy envious. During the day, I was the disappointing son, who wore off-the-rack suits and took the subway to a meaningless desk job at a mid-sized data firm. I sat through family dinners, absorbing their ridicule like a sponge, letting Thomas mock my entry-level lifestyle, while I was secretly authorizing billion-dollar transfers from my laptop under the table. The more they insulted me, the more I learned about their vulnerabilities. Every time my father bragged about a new acquisition, I was the one secretly shorting the stock, waiting for the moment his overextension would reach the breaking point. The status flip began to take shape 18 months ago when I realized that Sterling and Associates was finally desperate enough to look for a merger partner. My father was drowning, and he needed a massive infusion of capital to keep his social mask from slipping. He started looking for a savior, a company powerful enough to absorb his debts without asking too many questions. He didn't realize that I had spent years shaping Aether Global to be the exact glow he was searching for. I had carefully funneled all of his creditors into a single holding group, and then I bought that group. I didn't just own his debt. I owned his future. Throughout this entire process, my family remained blissfully unaware. To them, Aether Global was a mysterious, hyper-aggressive titan run by an anonymous board of directors. They spent months trying to secure a meeting with the Aether CEO, never, realizing that he was the same failed middle child they forced to sit at the kids' table during Thanksgiving. My father even had the audacity to tell me during one dinner that I should take notes on how Aether operated if I ever wanted to be more than a data coordinator. I took notes. All right, I took notes on exactly which of his properties I was going to liquidate first. The backstory wasn't just about revenge. It was about the surgical precision of patience. I allowed myself to be ridiculed and dismissed because it gave me the ultimate weapon, invisibility. While Thomas was busy being a junior partner and my father was busy being a king, I was busy being the owner. By the time they walked into that boardroom, the permanent foreclosure of their legacy had already been signed, sealed, and delivered. They thought they were coming to a merger. They didn't realize they were coming to an eviction. The janitor was finally ready to take out the trash. The boardroom air grew heavy, thick with a medical shock that seemed to paralyze every Sterling in the room. My father, the man who had spent 40 years commanding every space he entered, looked like a statue carved from cold gray marble. His hand was still resting on the back of the leather chair he had intended to occupy as the king of the merger, but his fingers were trembling. Thomas stood frozen by the water carafe, the glass in his hand vibrating against the wood. The silence wasn't just quiet. It was a surgical strike against their reality, a vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of their social mask. "Leo?" My father finally gasped, his voice sounding like dry parchment being torn. "What is the meaning of this? Why are you standing at that end of the table? Get away from there before you embarrass us further in front of the Aether board." I didn't answer him immediately. I pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the seat reserved for the ultimate authority, and sat down with a slow, deliberate glow of confidence. I placed the $20 bill. Thomas had flicked at me during dinner onto the polished mahogany surface, right next to the 300-page merger contract. "Sit down, Arthur," I said, using his first name for the first time in my life. "You're making a scene, and we have a lot of work to do before the markets open." The chairman of the board, a man my father had been trying to impress for months, cleared his throat and looked at my family with a mixture of pity and professional coldness. "Arthur, Thomas, I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding on your part. You didn't come here to negotiate with Aether Global. You came here to surrender to its founder. And since Leo holds 90% of the voting shares, I suggest you listen to what he has to say." Thomas dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Founder Leo? He's a data coordinator. He works for a mid-tier firm in the suburbs," Thomas shouted, his face turning a shade of purple that matched his expensive silk tie. "This is some kind of joke. Leo, stop this right now. You're going to cost us the deal of a century." "The deal of a century was over the moment you flicked that $20 at me. Thomas," I said, leaning forward into the light. "And as for my meaningless desk job, you're right, I was a data coordinator. I coordinated the data that tracked every single offshore account, every hidden debt, and every forged invoice Sterling and Associates has used to stay afloat for the last 5 years. While you were busy being a junior partner, I was busy being your landlord." I tapped a command on my tablet, and the massive projector screen behind me flickered to life. It didn't show the celebratory merger slides my father had prepared. It showed a ghost ledger, a redlined audit of the Sterling family's actual finances. The numbers were catastrophic. The permanent foreclosure they had been running from was displayed in high definition for every partner to see. My father's eyes darted across the screen, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts as he realized I had documented the $50 million embezzlement he had used to fund my sister's galleries and Thomas's gambling debts. "This is private information," my father roared, finally finding his voice, though it was hollow and desperate. "You've stolen internal documents. This merger is supposed to save this firm, not destroy it. If you're really the head of Aether, then you should be protecting your investment." "I am protecting my investment, Arthur," I replied, my voice as cold as a surgical strike. "But you aren't the investment. The employees you've lied to are the investment. The clients you've cheated are the investment. You and Thomas are just the outdated methods that need to be removed from the system. This isn't a merger anymore. It's a total liquidation of the Sterling family's control." The status flip was total. The board members who had once bowed to my father were now looking at me for instructions, their pens poised to sign whatever I put in front of them. My father looked at the $20 bill on the table, then at me, and finally at the permanent foreclosure on the screen. The janitor was no longer just cleaning the room. I was dismantling the entire building, and there wasn't a single thing the king could do to stop me. The power flip was not a gradual transition. It was a sudden, violent shift in the room's gravity that left my family gasping for air. Arthur, the man who had spent my entire life looking down at me as if I were a smudge on his expensive lenses, was now staring at a reality he couldn't manipulate. The surgical strike had landed. He looked at the legal documents. I slid across the table, a set of papers that didn't promise a partnership, but a complete and total surrender. The glow of his authority had vanished, replaced by the flickering, fluorescent light of a man who realized he had been checkmated by the very piece he had dismissed as a pawn. "Sign it, Arthur," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the boardroom. "It's a full rescission of your executive authority. You're being removed for cause financial, negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. If you sign now, Aether Global will cover the legal fees for the inevitable civil suits. If you don't, I'll hand that ghost ledger to the district attorney before the elevator hits the lobby." My father's hand shook as he reached for the gold-plated pen he always used to finalize his conquests. He looked at Thomas, who was leaning against the wall, white-faced and trembling. There was no status flip left for them to play. They had walked into this building thinking they were about to be crowned, but they were actually being led to the chopping block. The medical shock of the situation seemed to have robbed Arthur of his ability to speak. He looked at me, searching for a spark of the failed middle child he could still bully, but all he found was the cold, analytical gaze of the CEO who now owned his debts. You're "You're really doing this?" he whispered, the gold pen hovering over the signature line. "After everything I gave you? I raised you in luxury, Leo. I gave you the sterling name. You didn't give me anything but a reason to work harder than you ever did," I replied, leaning back and watching him with clinical detachment. "You gave me a seat at the end of the table and a lifetime of ridicule. You taught me that the only way to survive in your world was to be more ruthless than the man who raised me. So don't talk to me about what you gave me. You're just signing a document that reflects the truth you've been hiding for years." With a ragged breath, Arthur pressed the pen to the paper. The scratching sound of his signature was the final nail in the coffin of the sterling legacy. As he finished, I reached out and pulled the document toward me, checking the ink before nodding to the security team standing by the door. The permanent foreclosure on his career was now official. "Thomas, you too," I said, gesturing to the secondary resignation for the junior partners. My brother didn't even argue. He signed with a frantic, desperate speed, his social mask completely gone, leaving behind only the terrified boy, who had never learned how to build anything of his own. "Now," I said, standing up and smoothing my charcoal jacket, "security will escort you to your former offices. You have 10 minutes to collect your personal belongings. Anything related to company business, including the cars, the laptops, and the club memberships, is now the property of Aether Global. And Arthur, don't forget that $20 I took earlier. Consider it the first payment on the massive debt you owe the people you've cheated." The janitor had finished the sweep. As my father and brother were led out of the room, their heads bowed and their shoulders slumped, the remaining board members turned to me, waiting for their new orders. I didn't feel the rush of triumph I expected. I only felt the steady, quiet hum of a system that had finally been balanced. I looked out the window at the city below, knowing that by tomorrow morning, the name on the building would change, and the ghost would finally be the only one left standing in the light. The silence that followed the exit of my father and brother was not peaceful. It was heavy with the medical shock of a dying empire. The remaining board members sat like statues, their eyes fixed on me as if I were a predator who had just finished a hunt. I didn't give them time to adjust. I tapped the final command on my tablet, and the surgical strike entered its terminal phase. The heavy mahogany doors didn't just open this time. They were held wide by a team of federal agents and windbreakers emblazoned with the letters FBI and SEC. "Leo, what have you done?" the former CFO stammered, his face turning the color of ash. "We were supposed to be protected under the merger umbrella. You said Aether would cover the liabilities." "I said Aether would cover the legal fees for the civil suits," I corrected him, my voice reflecting the cold glow of the monitor behind me. "I never said I would shield you from criminal prosecution. The ghost ledger I've been maintaining isn't just a record of debts. It's a chronological map of a 5-year conspiracy to defraud investors. You all thought you were getting a bailout. You didn't realize you were walking into a processing center. The status flip for the rest of the board was instantaneous. The men who had spent decades hiding behind offshore accounts and social masks were suddenly faced with the permanent foreclosure of their freedom. Agent Miller, a woman I had been collaborating with undercover for the better part of a year, stepped forward and began reading the charges. The room filled with the metallic click of handcuffs, a sound that was a symphony of justice, for every employee my father had ever laid off to protect his own bonus. "Arthur Sterling and Thomas Sterling are currently in the lobby being processed," Agent Miller announced, her gaze sweeping the room. "And as for the rest of you, your access to all Sterling and Associates servers has been revoked. The forensic data provided by the Aether founder has already been verified. This isn't an investigation anymore. It's a roundup." I stood at the head of the table, watching as the people who had ridiculed my meaningless desk job were let out one by one. They looked at me with a mixture of terror and disbelief, realizing too late that the janitor they had ignored was the one who had been documenting their every crime. My father had once told me that the only way to win was to own the room. I didn't just own the room. I owned the truth. The surgical strike had been perfect. I had managed to preserve the company's core assets and protect the pensions of the 3,000 employees who actually did the work, all while surgically removing the cancer of the executive suite. As the last board member was let out, Agent Miller turned to me. "You took a huge risk, Leo. If that ghost ledger hadn't been bulletproof, they would have buried you." "They tried to bury me for 25 years, I replied. looking at the empty seats around the table. They just didn't realize I was the kind of seed that grows in the dark. The room was finally clean. The janitor had finished the job. I walked over to the window, watching the sea of blue and red lights far below on the street. My father and brother were being loaded into separate vehicles, their status reduced to a case number. The glow of the sterling name was officially extinguished, replaced by the rising dawn of Aether Global. I reached into my pocket and felt the crumpled $20 bill Thomas had flicked at me. It was a worthless scrap of paper now, a relic of a world that no longer existed. I laid it on the empty table and walked away, not as a sterling, but as the man who had finally brought the house down to build something better. The final resolution didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt like waking up from a long, suffocating fever. 6 months after the night the boardroom fell silent, the sterling name had been scrubbed from the side of the skyscraper, replaced by the clean, minimalist glow of the Aether Global logo. The company was no longer a hollow shell built on debt and deceit. Under my leadership, we had implemented a surgical strike on corporate greed, turning the firm into a profit-sharing model where the people in the meaningless desk jobs finally saw the wealth they actually created. I stood behind the glass partition of the state penitentiary, looking at the man who used to be my father. Without his tailored suits and his social mask, Arthur Sterling looked small, his skin sallow under the harsh institutional lights. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling just as it had on the night of the merger. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't apologize. He only wanted to know if I was going to use my influence to get him an early release. "I'm not the janitor anymore, Arthur," I said, my voice calm and final. "I don't clean up your messes. You spent your life telling me that the world is a place of consequences. Now you're finally living in the one you built." I hung up the phone before he could respond, leaving him to the silence of the room. As I walked out of the prison and toward my car, I felt the warmth of the sun, a real glow that had nothing to do with digital monitors or high-stakes deals. My brother Thomas was in a similar facility 2 states over, and my sister had been forced to auction her entire collection to pay back the victims of the family's fraud. The permanent foreclosure on their arrogance was absolute. I am no longer the ghost in the corner or the disgrace at the dinner table. I am the man who proved that integrity is a more powerful currency than any stolen billion. I reached into my pocket and touched a small, framed photo of my grandmother, the only one who saw the glow in me before I built the fire. The system was finally balanced.